work really hard as volunteers to make these events happen and to work toward the mission that we have in common with other chapters of the Reading League. So together, we are committed to advancing evidence-aligned reading instruction throughout Virginia. We're so glad you're here with us tonight. On that note, we'd love for you to, that if you have not already, we'd love for you to become a member of the Reading League Virginia, and we will share that link. Fortunately, the membership is free. Thank you to our sponsor, Just Right Reader, who is actually our sponsor for tonight's event as well. So please take advantage of that free membership. There's a lot to offer as far as perks, and we'll go over that at the end of our session. As the Reading League Virginia, we aspire to ensure that every educator is prepared to implement evidence-aligned practices to meet the diverse profiles of all students with the goal of becoming skilled lifelong readers. Our mission is to advance the awareness, understanding, and use of evidence-aligned reading instruction. In that spirit, we are absolutely thrilled to welcome, as we've just learned, one of our own Virginians, Dr. Julia Lindsay, our literacy expert who partners with districts to transform literacy or reading outcomes. She is the author of Reading Above the Fray and Small Groups, Big Results, an upcoming book that shares solutions for differentiation in literacy instruction. Dr. Lindsay's work focuses on building teacher knowledge, supporting the implementation of evidence-based practices and materials, and ensuring all students can become successful, empowered young readers. Dr. Lindsay holds a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology from Davidson College, a Master's in Arts and Teaching from Relay Graduate School of Education, and a PhD in Educational Studies from the University of Michigan. She's a proud former elementary school teacher. Dr. Lindsay, thank you for joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation on supporting comprehension in small groups.
Thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. It's so great to see everyone and get to come together and talk about reading and research and get the chance to really dive in together tonight. Please do feel free to put questions or comments in the chat as I'm talking. I would love to try to answer any questions that come up as we go and really engage in conversation together. So we're going to go ahead and dive into talking about supporting comprehension in small groups. We'll start with, I'll just add a little bit more to my bio so that you get to know me a little bit more. Again, my name is Dr. Julia Lindsay. And I started my career in the classroom. I taught kindergarten and first grade in New York City. And like so many of us, had just a wonderful time teaching reading and writing, but had a lot of strange situations going on in my reading classroom that nobody around me knew how to handle. So I have some really specific memories, like a kindergartner who never, ever blended words back together the whole year. And a whole bunch of support folks around me saying, well, she'll grow out of that. It'll go away. She understands the text because she could tell us about, you know, what was happening in these level A, level B, level C texts. So it's fine. Or a first grader who seemed totally fine, was on the road to reading and then hit about that level F and suddenly everything disappeared. And he needed so much support and intervention, but of course, we were doing that intervention also through a level text framework. And so things were not fully coming together with that either. And then so many memories of sitting with a child, trying to help them read and coming up to a word and saying, just sound it out. And then trying to sound it out myself and feeling like confused, feeling like I wasn't 100% sure what was going on, having to say to that child, I guess this one's weird. Here, I'll just give you the word. And all of these moments that really made me wonder what even was reading and how did it actually come together for children. And unfortunately, at my school, there just wasn't a deep bench of expertise around this. And we were using what I think a lot of people were at that time, certainly in New York City, which was this real framework of balanced literacy and a lot of emphasis on the text leveling systems. So I went and got a master's degree. I actually took it upon myself to go to PDs that my school wasn't even paying for because I was just like desperate for information. And frankly, I learned nothing about reading in any of those scenarios. So finally, I was like, okay, I guess I'll go get a PhD. So I went to the University of Michigan, where I started my PhD. And within a month of being there, I was absolutely floored with the information I was learning about what research actually says about reading. And all of this information about how we could actually teach kids to blend sounds, for example. And I was both inspired and also a little infuriated and also quite guilty in all sorts of different ways. And I got particularly excited about a concept that we all now know a lot more about called decodable texts. And so this sent me down a journey, which got me a lot of side eyes, a lot of people questioning what I was thinking about, what I was doing. But I was determined to say, we had some compelling research about this in the early 2000s. Why was it abandoned? And what could be done here differently to make these texts really work for kids and to make them really work in classrooms. So that was kind of one of the main pillars of my research, was really around exploring excellence in decodable texts and how to create the best teaching circumstances with those as well. And as I was building that work, I was also building conversation with other educators. And that's where my first book, Reading Above the Fray, comes from, which was just, I wanted to be able to share with other teachers all of these amazing things that I had learned in the research world that I wished I had known in my classroom, and to help people take some swaps, some steps forward in their reading teaching. And then I was so excited about continuing to share that I moved into a space where I now work directly with districts, transforming literacy outcomes by thinking about our whole systems, and also down to all of the critical instructional practices that we need to keep in mind. And my second book, Small Groups, Big Results, which we're going to talk some about tonight, of course, is coming out in about a month. So if you're intrigued by this conversation tonight, that's a place that you can look for more. And as was stated, I am a Virginian, but both by childhood and by current. I grew up in Salem, Virginia, which, if you're not familiar, is down 81 near Roanoke. And I had a wonderful childhood there in the Salem City Schools, and then moved back to Virginia as an adult. And now I live in Loudoun County with my husband. And so happy to be here with all of my fellow Virginians and get to talk more about reading. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and dive into the content. Again, if you have questions or comments, please feel free to ask them along the way. So my hope for today, which I just want to make sure, we all know it's a short amount of time. We'll have about 40 minutes or so of this. I'm going to talk about a way to think about small group instruction that is backed by research. It's not the only way that you can think about this. And I think that, sometimes it's hard to distinguish what is the best of multiple reasonable ideas. And so I'm not trying to say that there is necessarily one best here, but I think that hopefully this is one way that is grounded in the evidence that will be helpful as you continue to strive towards small group instruction that's really powerful. And then I'm also going to give you some really specific routines and ideas that are designed to think about how we might be meeting kids' needs in that comprehension work in the small group space. And we're going to look at some things across kind of a range of student skill levels and abilities, so that we can kind of talk to how comprehension does interact with kids reading across time. So I'm not going to necessarily solve everything tonight. If only, that would be great. But hopefully we'll get you some interesting ideas and some interesting research findings as well. So we're going to go ahead and start by just talking broadly about small group instruction. And I like to start here because small group instruction is a bit of a minefield. And one of the reasons why I think that is because there isn't actually a good definition of small group instruction. It's actually just meaningless other than group size. Small group instruction doesn't mean anything. It just means that you had a smaller group of children than a whole class. In most research, this would be about 5 or fewer kids would be considered like a true small group. But beyond that, there actually isn't like a shared definition among researchers, among teachers, among institutions, etc. And so because of that, I think that sometimes it grabs baggage from various places. So I want to start here by thinking about, well, what is the purpose of utilizing a smaller group? And then talking about what that could mean for our instructional choices. So here's the simple fact of the matter, is that our classrooms are diverse. Every teacher knows this in her heart. It's just, there's so many children with so many different strengths and needs in any given classroom. One study found that in an average upper elementary school classroom, there's going to be between 9 and 11 grade levels of skill in that individual room, which is just incredible to think about. Children who are literally potentially still solidifying alphabet knowledge and children who are reading complex chapter books can easily be sitting beside each other in an average classroom. And of course, we see this across grade levels from preschool all the way up and through probably through college, but let's just go ahead and stamp it on 12th grade. And we see that children are coming into our spaces with a lot of different needs and strengths that we need to meet in some kind of way. So the most obvious way to do this is, of course, to differentiate instruction, to meet their needs by adjusting aspects of our instruction, whether that's changing some of the additional information that we give children in our explicitness, adding more practice, changing how they are getting supported, changing other aspects of how we're scaffolding that. We have to differentiate in some kind of way. And now sometimes there's this question about if differentiation actually causes an impact and how that differentiation might be delivered. So I think it's helpful to know a few things. First, research does generally find that small group instruction that's focused on differentiating the experience in reading is associated with better outcomes than exclusively utilizing whole group instruction. So in studies, which granted there are not tons of these, but in the studies that we do have, where there has been an ability to compare a group of students who only get whole class instruction to a group of students who get whole class instruction and the differentiated small group instruction that they may need, we see superior outcomes in that second group. Second, we see that research does find that differentiation helps all aspects of reading and writing. So when we are able to more precisely target kids' needs and give them more of what they need instructionally, we do see improvements pretty much across everything, across all types of skills. And finally, research does find that differentiated instruction supports kids in every demographic category, K-12, which might be surprising, but we have research that includes children who are very young and research on children all the way through high school, gifted children, children with diagnosed reading disabilities, children who are deemed at risk, children who only speak English, children who are multilingual, pretty much every category that you can think of that can be studied in research, we do have evidence that differentiated instruction does support these kids. And I think it makes sense when we think about it. Of course, meeting kids' particular needs is probably going to lead to better outcomes. But naturally, we've got to caveat this because there are a lot of challenges with using smaller groups in order to give differentiated instruction. The biggest one and probably the most obvious is that they're simply more expensive. Designing a small group experience that's really excellent takes time. So time from the classroom as a whole, but also time in terms of planning. It often takes actual money because we have to purchase the books, or if you are in a situation where you feel that you don't have enough materials, maybe not now, but maybe at some point in your career, we've probably all been in a position where we've bought stuff off of Teachers Pay Teachers or wherever, spending our own money on trying to figure out how to support these particular needs. And of course, they're expensive because the other children in the classroom are now no longer benefiting from direct explicit instruction by their teacher, and they are left to their own devices. We also know that small group instruction is often connected to practices that are not supported by research, that we have a long history that we'll get into a little bit more in a second of practices that are not supported and in some cases like directly antithetical to findings that we have from research that may hold baggage in this space of small group instruction. And of course, the last one, again, like I had mentioned, there's really no shared definition of what small group instruction would be. What would be the structure? What's the timing? When is it used? Why is it used? These things are not necessarily shared across every single study that you might see, or across every person on the internet talking about this, or thinkers in other spaces. So it's hard to have good conversations when we don't hold the same definition. So there's all of these particular challenges. And again, we really can't understate them. It is really difficult to think about how are we navigating all of these things at once. And in particular, one that is probably on many of our minds, at least in the past, potentially not exactly right now, is this hangover that we might have from utilizing mostly a guided reading approach in small group instruction. So again, this is how I taught when I was teaching. This was the clear expectation of my school. And so this is not, an indictment of anything other than we're all learning, we're all having the ability to continue to change. But I do think that as that happens, it's important to know a couple things about the research that we have on guided reading. So the first one I think is pretty surprising, which is that in a recent meta-analysis, so a study of many studies that is done in order to make a more general claim, the researchers could not find a single study on guided reading that used methods that would let us estimate the impact. So there were never any studies done that were high quality that could show that guided reading positively impacted kids' outcomes. The reason this is surprising is because of how long guided reading was the dominant thing that was being used to teach reading in classrooms. And yet, despite that dominance, there was not a connected dominance in research. Second, we know that right now that there is no empirical evidence that shows that those level text assessments that are generally used to guide guided reading predict reading achievement. So when I was teaching, and it was a very clear message given to us by, administration, that we needed to get kids in kindergarten to a level D, and we needed to get kids in first grade to a level J. And the experience that I had was that this meant that if kids hit that, then they were going to be fine, that they were going to be well on their way to being a reader, that I was doing everything that I needed to get them to be a reader, and that I could have confidence that I was sending them off to the next grade level and they were going to continue to succeed. Because what else would that mean? Why else would we be stamping like you have to get to this certain point? So of course, many of you might have experienced it, the surprise of learning that actually those levels were not predictive of future success. And we currently have no empirical evidence that shows a connection point between hitting a level at a certain age and then long-term success on other more valid measures of reading. So we can't show that those assessments actually are showing us that kids are able to have success. Finally, we know that kids don't show the same abilities in texts of the same levels. It's about a coin flip. You can flip a coin and have a kid read a level F text and give them another one, and that's about how much of a chance that they will read with the same fluency, which is, of course, not a great metric. And because of this and other research, we know that running records themselves are also not sensitive enough to operate as screeners, which we know Virginia has a lot of new assessments that are very high quality. But you might have used these in the past, and you might notice a big difference in who's identified as needing additional support, because running records were never really specific enough to identify the kids who really needed more from us. So all of these elements that are infused into many of our kind of imaginations and experiences of what small group reading is can cause complications in terms of trying to rethink it and trying to talk about, well, what could this be? And you might be thinking, okay, well, let's just not do it then. We should just get rid of it. You might be thinking let's just stop using small group altogether. You might have seen some recent headlines like this one: small group reading instruction is not as effective as you think. And saying okay, we just shouldn't use it at all. But my perspective on this is we have to instead think more clearly about the purpose of what we're doing with small group reading. Again, at a high level, the only definition that everyone will agree on is that small group means less than a whole class. So if we take that to be true, small group is less than a class, and if we acknowledge the truth of all the research that shows us that differentiated instruction in reading can be really powerful, then instead of vilifying a group size, because that's all small group is, it's a group size, and instead of letting maybe past experiences influence how we think about it, we instead say to ourselves, okay, so what do smaller groups get us? And what purpose would be most reasonable to use with these? So smaller groups do get us some very specific things. First off, they make it much easier to target specific needs and differentiate instruction. We all have had this experience of trying to differentiate in a whole class. Sometimes you can do it really well, and I absolutely think that you should continue to do that. But there's certain situations where you need to have a smaller group with you. This is sometimes skill-based, a group of kids who just needs a lot more to support their acquisition of those skills. And sometimes it's also behavior-based. The realities of school are that there are some kids who are not always able to learn at the same pace if they only experience that whole class instruction. And sometimes we need to get right in front of them in order to help them pursue those ideas. The second thing that smaller groups get us is that they make it a lot easier to ensure kids get enough practice. In order to solidify all of these reading skills that we have, you have to get an abundant amount of practice. One study that I think is particularly impressive found that kids need 1.8 practice opportunities per minute in order to reach optimal learning in whole class phonics or in a small group phonics experience. So tons of practice opportunities is necessary. And it's a lot easier in a smaller group to give targeted practice, but also to give kids accountability for that practice. Which leads us into our next idea, which is that smaller groups make it much easier to give kids direct feedback. We don't actually want kids just to practice. We want them to practice well. And so by having kids in a smaller group, we can actually give feedback on things like their decoding, their articulation, the ideas that they're saying, their fluency. And all of these are very, very challenging, if not sometimes impossible, because the ear can only hear so many voices at once to give feedback on whole class. And finally, we know that smaller group instruction can bolster the impact of whole class instruction. In other words, when we are reasonable about thinking about how can small group give me the opportunity to give kids targeted, supported practice in exactly their point of need that flows out of my whole class instruction, rather than being in its own weird little bubble, then we can use that as this powerful way to bolster our whole class instruction. Rather than thinking about these things as separate, as antagonistic, or as like only one or only the other, but instead thinking, yes, your whole class core instruction is your guide, and how can you leverage this tool of small group when needed to make a big difference? So what does small group let us do? Well, again, it's really this space where kids can get super targeted practice with lots of opportunities for direct feedback. It's also another way you can think about it is that it's a place to solve challenges. So for example, if you have a kid like I did who just never blended sounds back together, first of all, your first step, I should have fixed my whole class instruction and given some more instruction in targeted phonemic awareness. But if I was already doing that, then I can leverage the small group space to pull that child and others who are having a similar challenge and target that particular need before they ever need to be taken all the way down through an intervention protocol. But instead, they're meeting those needs in the classroom as much as we can so that we can bolster our whole class efforts. So this is kind of our starting point, is thinking about how do we think about small group a little bit differently as this tool that flows out of our whole class work rather than as something that is kind of off on its own pathway. We have a question there. What does this look like in a schedule? It's a great question. So generally, I would say that the main thing to think about is that you don't want to be giving a lot of time to this. So your majority time you should be dedicating to teaching reading and writing in the whole class. And so that might look like an hour of combined content-rich reading and writing instruction, half an hour of phonics and phonemic awareness instruction in K2, maybe pushing into the upper grades as needed, and maybe a half hour where you're able to meet with differentiated small groups. That might be that's like the most basic answer I might give, but it would really be dependent on what are the needs in your class and how much do you actually need to meet in a differentiated manner. If you really want to get crazy with it, you can always adjust day by day or week by week, but that is a planning challenge and it is a logistical hurdle that not everybody is going to want to take. But the biggest thing I would say is think about the whole class as the queen, the king, the jewel, and then we move from there into the small groups when we need to. And in doing so, that means we have to be a little bit more flexible than we might be used to in the past. We might have a group that we meet with for 10 minutes to solidify some decoding stuff, and then a different group that we meet with just for 5 minutes to solidify something related to a particular sound spelling, and a group that we meet with for 10 minutes to work on a fluency reading. So thinking about how we might be meeting those needs, the need is going to drive your schedule rather than the schedule driving you to say, what am I going to fill this time with? So that's kind of my quick, hopefully helpful idea there. Okay, so you might be wondering, is this worth it? Does it work? So I do want to just share a quick story. This is some data from a school that I work with in Indiana. They started the year last year with 100% of their first graders in an at-risk category. This is a decoding assessment that you're looking at. And then they started a more systematic phonics program, and they had been using a phonics program. They just changed programs. And about halfway through the year, they got to a point where they still had about 40% of kids at risk, but everybody else was moving into those meeting and exceeding expectations. And then we started working in small group in a way where we said, okay, who really needs this? How are we pulling those needs in a targeted manner to bolster whole class instruction? And within 2 months, we're able to get to a place where 100% of kids were meeting or exceeding expectations, and about 60% were actually exceeding. So when we think about the needs in our classroom, and then we design the instruction to meet those needs, we really can make a big difference. And we really can see movement in kids' skills. Okay, so that's kind of our big picture background idea to help you understand how I think about small group instruction and to give you an opportunity to consider how it might feel to think about that in your classroom. That was pretty fast, and I know it wasn't all of the details. Again, we have limited time together today, so I am doing my best to try to hit the highlights. But I know that you might have follow-up questions, and if I don't get to them today, you can always email me. So let's get a little bit more specific in talking about comprehension. So we first are going to think about, all right, what needs are we going to theoretically meet in a smaller group? And on the screen, you'll see a graphic that is sort of similar in some ways to the reading rope, but is kind of meant to look across time instead of at a singular moment. And this is not a model of reading, it's just a graphic, but you're going to see some similarities with something like the reading rope. So when we think about word recognition, we think about children moving in phases across alphabet knowledge, decoding skills, more advanced decoding skills, such as dealing with syllables and morphemes, strengthening their fluency, and then moving into a more proficient reading stage. When we think about language comprehension, it doesn't really operate in that same sort of stair-step ladder kind of manner. It's much more dynamic, and it's much more based on children's growing knowledge base. Over time, children do become more strategic in their ability to deploy these language skills. And as you see with the kind of color gradation here, over time, those language comprehension skills become more and more intermingled with their word recognition skills. You cannot, for example, be a fluent reader if you don't also already know what's going on in the text. You can't respond to punctuation if you're not also engaged in language comprehension. So across all of these areas, kids need to practice and apply different things in order to reach greater proficiency. To be frank, the case for small group instruction is much stronger in this word recognition arena. It's a much clearer case to make from research. We have a lot more evidence, and it is much easier to demonstrate how we can clearly move children's skills along. The case for small group instruction in language comprehension and later in reading comprehension if children are engaged in a reading task is a little bit murkier to make. And this is for a couple different reasons. The first is because oftentimes it takes much longer to effectively move children's language. Rather than teaching a child to decode, which might take a couple months to a year, teaching a child more about language in research, some of those studies take 2, 3, 4 years to really produce results because it's much more challenging to move that. We also know that language comprehension is less skills-based than word recognition, and so it's slightly more challenging to really target some of these particular areas. So the first thing I'll say is that when we think about supporting into language comprehension, we really want to think about first supporting into those decoding skills. So this is an example of how you might assess children's skills and identify what could be targeted in a smaller group. And if we're talking about children in the grades 3 and above, we would probably start up here. And if we're talking about really young children, we would just start where kind of our grade level skills are. But if we think about assessing children's reading comprehension and they're in 3rd grade and above, and they have on or above grade level skills, it's unlikely that they will need any time in small group instruction, and certainly not significant time in small group instruction in order to continue to grow as a reader. Again, because if we are focusing our energies on that really strong, knowledge-rich core instruction in a whole class, children who are on grade level readers at those ages are unlikely to need much small group instruction. They might have some experiences in small group, but they probably don't need significant experiences. And then if we think about the children who are not on grade level in those, then we start thinking about all of the underlying areas that feed into proficient reading. The first being, they might have sufficient fluency, but still not be accessing text. And those are the children that we really want to think about in terms of targeting more comprehension work. But not before we ensure that they actually do have that. If they do not have adequate fluency, continuing to identify via other assessments of word recognition, such as multisyllabic and single syllable decoding, but also down to phonemic awareness and alphabet work, to ensure that we are actually targeting kind of the lowest rung on this scale. Because if a child cannot read words, it really doesn't matter how much support we give in comprehension. They will not be able to succeed until we are able to identify and then support into that decoding need. So we're really talking, when we talk about targeting comprehension, we're talking about children who are already fairly fluent readers. Again, unlike decoding development, comprehension is just not so linear. There's all these various aspects going into comprehension of an individual text. We know a lot of comprehension is text dependent. It is based on children's knowledge, not just the skills and strategies that they are bringing to that moment, but it is based on this kind of more complex plethora of abilities brought into this individual moment. So the biggest challenge of all of this is going to be that we don't want to overemphasize the potential here. When we are thinking about small group instruction related to comprehension, we don't want to kind of get ahead of ourselves. And I think that that is another area where the era of guided reading kind of took us astray. There was a huge emphasis on teaching children comprehension in small groups, even in kindergarten. And that is really not necessarily going to be a good use of your time. So instead, we want to think like in a much more pragmatic manner. Indeed, we actually have one meta-analysis that found that vocabulary interventions delivered whole class were more effective than those delivered small group. So really want to just kind of tie this up with a bow to make sure that we are being clear-eyed about the possibilities here. There is absolutely a reason to think about, hey, we have this group of kids, they're just not getting it. Great. Maybe a small group is the right place to meet that need. we're reading this text. It's really complex in its structure. And I have a group of kids that consistently struggles to understand text structure. Great, that's a perfect opportunity to meet those needs in a smaller group. Or I have this group of kids that are just never making an inference about the meaning of a new word in a text. That's something to easily target in a small group. But what is probably not going to be a good use of time is kind of the endless comprehension work, kind of roller coaster that kids get on, where they're learning like a strategy a week or something like that within a small group experience. So when we think about comprehension, then you might be wondering, well, what are we going to talk about for the rest of this time that's actually going to be beneficial? Well, I promise you, we do have things. We're going to talk in two categories. The first is thinking about, okay, well, these kids who are growing their word recognition and fluency, we still do want to bring appropriate connections to meaning making into those experiences. Any text you read is an opportunity to understand. And though some texts are very light on the deeper meaning, they all mean something. And it's important to recognize that that is still comprehension, even if it's not our clear target. And second, after children have mastered decoding, sometimes they do still need extra support from us in terms of developing comprehension. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Our quick kind of principles for this are that we're going to remember not all kids are going to need small group work with comprehension. When our whole class work is excellent, we're going to see less children needing this support in smaller groups. We also know that small group instruction in comprehension absolutely must be connected to knowledge development. Ideally, that's connected via the content that you are already teaching in ELA, your reading class, whatever you call it, science or social studies. If there is some reason why that cannot occur, it should be at a minimum still connected to texts that are building kids' knowledge through a set of experiences where they're reading multiple texts on the same topic and hopefully also related to their interests. Comprehension also in small groups should flow out of the whole class content and experiences, not be an isolated pathway. So ensuring that children are getting this experience of moving, of seeing the connection points across the day rather than having two very discrete experiences with what reading is, but instead having one consistent lived experience. So we're going to now get into some examples. I'm going to show you 3 examples of what this might look like in terms of supporting comprehension in smaller groups. And we're going to take these kind of 3 steps as we do it. We'll think about, okay, well, the first step is always going to be identifying needs via data, via clear assessments, and then making a plan. The second is going to be teaching with a targeted routine that highly focuses on the right kinds of practice and feedback that kids need to actually master that particular skill. And finally, always embracing that flexibility, acknowledging that some kind of challenges that kids might encounter get solved very fast. Children who, for example, are kind of getting confused by one particular text and you pull them into a small group to work on that text, might not need that same scaffold the following week. But continuing to adjust rigor and move on to new skills or move children out of that particular experience. So we're going to look at these 3 examples across the range of development. So we'll start with children who are developing decoding skills. And we're going to be thinking about those decoders who are not right at the very beginning. We're not talking about kids who are like looking at a word cat and saying cat, and then going to the next word and saying and can. We're not talking about those kids who are still like genuinely not developing even the CVC word level. We're talking about children who are slightly further along, who can read some words automatically, but are continuing to decode words with new sound spellings that they're encountering. Particularly, they might still be working on solidifying knowledge about long vowels. But they have more fluency than decoding every single word in a really, really intense way. So when we are thinking about these developing decoders, we can start thinking about how we are also supporting their access to meaning. And texts can support multiple aspects of meaning, multiple aspects of development at once. So what you see on the screen here is a Just Right Reader text that is doing 2 things. It is an informational text that is about sharks that introduces novel vocabulary, probably to a first grader. And based on the scope and sequence, it is also highly decodable for a particular moment in kids' phonics development. So children, it's not 100% decodable, but it does have accessible decodability. In research, there actually has never been a perfect level of decodability found. So nobody knows exactly how decodable does a text need to be to fully support a decoder. But the estimate right now is that it has to be at least like 70, 80% decodable words and high frequency words to really be helpful. For children who are at the very earliest stages, it's going to be probably ideally closer to 100. And then this text, I think I counted before, is more like 90. So is a good space for children who are continuing to develop those skills. It might feel a little scary to think about these words that might not be decodable yet, but part of decoding development is when children start being able to sometimes, not all kids, not children with dyslexia, for example, but start being able to access words that might surprise you because they have developed enough of an understanding of English orthography that they engage in a process that we call self-teaching. Now, you don't want to rely on that because that's only going to come out of an abundant knowledge of decoding, but some kids might come up to dorsal and be able to figure that word out. In other cases, you might help them by chunking that word, or if it's really far outside of kids' abilities in this one particular circumstance, you might just give kids the word. There are several research studies that have kind of investigated this, and in this really tiny way, that's okay. It's not going to harm them. As long as the overall structure of your decoding instruction is strongly grounded in clarity around teaching phonics and decoding. And these, if there's like, 3 opportunities to read the word dorsal, it will be okay. And this will add this deeper meaning into this conversation. But the number one goal of decodable text is that kids need to be decoding. So when we think about the structure of our actual experience, we're going to take 4 key steps. Review the sound spelling correspondences that you have previously taught and have kids say those sounds. Give some explicit instruction in the target decoding skill. Have kids practice using, even if it can even just be a word list. You don't need a lot of materials here. They can practice reading or spelling, just a list of words. Some of those should come from the text that you're going to read because repetition here is ideal. Children need at least 8 opportunities to decode every individual word in order to become proficient with that word. And finally, application, where you get the chance to read. We're going to start with a purpose that's not we're decoding. It's going to be something better than that. It could be, I thought this book was interesting. I hope you do too. It could be, we're learning about animals, habitats, and features, and we're reading yet another book about that. And then we can end with some sort of text-dependent question. Again, like 1, and it's not like the deepest thing you've ever done because the text will not be the deepest thing you've ever done. But acknowledging that as children gain more proficiency in decoding and they're reading some words automatically, we have to start integrating more complexity into their experience for them to continue to grow. While kids are reading, you're also going to want to focus on prompting them with prompts to decode words. Again, recognizing that we're talking about text that would have some words that are not necessarily fully decodable. So that's, again, an acknowledgement of what you would do with those words. You might give extra information about the orthographic patterns. CH spells ch, try it. Or you might tell them the word in these very, very small circumstances. Finally, again, we're going to make this clear connection to meaning, giving a reason for this beyond, I think, we need to practice decoding, but instead saying like, we're going to read a book about sharks because we're learning these particular animal features and then asking that text-dependent question. But don't forget, if you're working on small group instruction at this phase where children are actively learning to decode, the primary purpose of your lesson should be, in fact, decoding. So don't get too distracted by this support of trying to integrate a slightly more complex experience in text. As kids' skills increase, they do need to encounter more complex text, and we have to orient them towards meaning, but you want to balance that with what you are also seeing. If you put children in a text like this and you realize that their skills very rapidly deteriorate, they weren't ready for that level of challenge, and that's completely okay. If you put kids in a text like this and you realize they were really doing great, except for those few non-decodable words that were really a struggle, then again, you might lessen the rigor for a little bit. You might look for texts that are more highly decodable, or you might consider other ways that you can continue to gain their access and skills to those more complex patterns through additional phonics instruction. So keep your focus at this stage on decoding, but make sure that kids are also getting the clear message that we do read in order to understand. Next up is kids who are a little bit more advanced. So we're thinking about those children who are getting into morphemes, getting into some new words. By third grade, about 60% of the new words that kids encounter are going to have 2 or more morphemes. So 2 parts holding meaning, like prefix. Ironically, has 2 parts, has a prefix. So kids need to understand the meanings of these words because they're going to see them a lot. They need to be able to decode them. But one of the things that I think is most fascinating about this kind of part of development is children really have to be able to inference the meanings of words. Kids who are beyond the decoding stage are learning about 2,000 to 3,000 new words every year as they continue on their journey to become a proficient reader. But we can normally only explicitly teach maybe 400 words. So instead, we want to make sure to give children access to understanding morphemes, those parts of words that hold meaning, to improve their reading, their spelling, and their comprehension. Again, we'll take the same 4 steps, review some previously taught morphemes. That should be occurring in the whole class. Pronunciation, spelling, and meaning. Introduce or reintroduce the new morpheme that you're working on. Again, reteaching from whole group is the best opportunity here. Have kids briefly practice. Again, it can be a word list. It does not have to be something complicated or a word web where we're thinking about how that morpheme interacts with other parts of words. And then have kids read in a text where they're going to have the opportunity to continue to engage with that text. And as they are doing that, we can also teach in to the ability to use the morpheme to identify the meaning of the word, not just to decode the word. When kids use the morphemes in word to determine meaning, we have better comprehension. And we also know that they are going to need to identify and understand the meanings of new words. I'm not talking about 3Qing. I'm not talking about kids thinking about the meaning of the word and the meaning of the sentence. I'm talking about children who are already proficient decoders, who already know about morphemes in a word, and then are leveraging that after they've decoded to identify the meaning of a word. So this is a very separate conversation. So when children are reading in text and we get up to a morpheme that they know, having them break that word into the morpheme to both decode it and then afterwards to identify the meaning. In addition to doing that in text, we can also do that just in sentences. Work like with maze sentences where you have children identify between 2 similar words, 2 words that are different by just 1 morpheme. And then we can have a discussion about why we know it's that one because of the meaning, but also sometimes because of the grammar. Or similarly in connected sentences, where we are really focusing on that target, prefix, suffix, or root, and talking about why that word is what it is and what it means. And this is one way that we can help children start getting better at inferencing the meaning of words, which is vocabulary, which is a big part of comprehension. I am skipping slides a little bit and going very fast because I'm at pretty much the time. So if you're wondering why things feel less clear, that's why. Okay, so let me just quickly get into the last bit, which is supporting kids who are ready to work on comprehension. So thinking about children who are more specifically in a comprehension phase. These children are fluent readers, but they still do some of these things. They might kind of blankly stare at a book when you ask them to retell. They might be really good with narratives, but not so good at informational texts. They might just kind of restate the title. You try to ask any question and you get blank stares, but you are 100% confident that they can read because you have clear assessment data that shows you that. So one additional thing that we can target in small group is supporting them in better using the text structure. This is also something you should and can teach in your whole class, but you might give a little bit more structure to this in a smaller group. We're using the same 4 steps again, where we might review some previously learned information about text structure. Then we engage in explicit instruction in utilizing different text structures to support retells and eventually summarizations and inferences. Then we have children read the text, identify and co-create a main idea statement, and ask them to continue that along with other texts and other knowledge. So what do I mean by teach text structure? Well, we know that strong readers are going to use the text structure to organize ideas. And so we want to teach readers who don't know how to do this as well. Again, we primarily want to teach this in a whole group, and then in smaller groups, we can potentially give more scaffolding, like supporting children in identifying more about text structure by using clearer signal words, but also giving them more really precise sentence stems in order to generate a get the gist or main idea statement. In this particular arena, when you're thinking about text selection and you're not thinking about decodable text, thinking about texts that are really clear representations of those structures and genres, again, connected to science, social studies, and read aloud topics, and ideally in a set where at least 6 texts on the same topical area. And finally, go for grade level difficulty. Don't be afraid of complex text. These, again, we're talking about now children who are readers, so we should be leveraging complex texts. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap myself up there. But I want to just ask, what's one thing that you're going to take away from this session? I said probably a lot because I was trying to get in so much information. I always, this is my fatal flaw, is that I always want to say more than there's time for. So I want you to take a moment to think about one thing that you're taking away and recognizing that hopefully if you have questions, you can get my new book or you can follow up via email so that I can try to get some of those answered.
I'm going to wait for some of those chats to come in. I'm excited to hear what everyone is saying. I took a ton of notes, but I want to make it short and sweet. But thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay, for giving us a little bit of perspective on your journey and how you got where you are. But also, I wrote down so many key points that I wanted to talk about. But rethinking small groups as being a place to solve challenges with targeted practice and feedback. We kind of have to reframe how we look at those small groups. And then number 1, kids need to know that we read to understand and that we can start with the most simple decodable text to make that happen. So I tried to make it short and sweet, but I'm really looking forward to your new book. I just added it to my cart. So it's there for pre-order. Did we have anyone put in the chat anything? Let's see. Yep, text structure lesson for comprehension is my takeaway. Thank you, Tony. Thank you for your presentation, looking deeper at decoding and impacting instruction. Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, and I do want to mention certificates will be shared out after the meeting. We're just collecting attendees information, so I do see that question in there. But yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay. I really appreciate it. I do want to also mention that tonight's event and our free membership, which we'll put that in the chat, are thanks to Just Right Reader. So I want to hand it off to Catherine from Just Right Reader and also say thank you so much for your support this year. We've had some amazing events thanks to you guys.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Lindsay. That was wonderful. As a former reading intervention teacher, I really just couldn't have learned more or enjoyed that more. And definitely resonated with a lot of the examples you gave at the beginning of working with students and being like, I don't know why I can't explain this to you. So just really, really appreciate that. We feel super lucky at Just Right Reader to be able to partner with the Reading League so that teachers on the ground are able to learn from amazing researchers like Dr. Lindsay. Yeah, just a little bit about Just Right Reader. You can go to the next slide. Perfect. So we were founded 3 years ago by our CEO and founder, Sarah Rich. And what makes our decodables really special is that we are always basing everything in our decodables on the best research around the science of reading. And we are working with the very best minds out there to create our decodables, including our very own, Dr. Lindsay. You can go to the next slide. Yeah. We are a VDOE approved resource and working across many districts in Virginia. And we know that across Virginia and the nation, early literacy remains such a key area of focus. And particularly, still post-COVID, just such an area that we want to dig into and support our students. And many students, especially in those early grades, need really intentional skill-based support to build foundational reading skills. And we are here to partner with school districts and with schools in order to provide students with those intentional foundational products. You can go to the next slide. So I like to think is we have two separate products. We have our classroom libraries and we have our Take Everywhere literacy packs. And Just Right Reader is a supplement. So we've created curriculum alignments that match all of the instruction that you're already doing in your core, but really those, as Dr. Lindsay mentioned, those decodables that you can use. And we'll show you the phonics alignment that goes along with your core curriculum. So really it's like, here you go. Here are the books that you want to teach when you're teaching Short U. And as it said in an earlier slide, our books are about 90% decodable. Our secret sauce is that what makes us super special is that all of our books, on all of our books, you can scan on the back a QR code that leads to a phonics lesson. These are 2 to 3 minutes long. They're super short, but they provide that extra instruction and are easy for independent student work or station work, small group work. And at home, something beautiful that's happened that we didn't even realize was going to happen is that families are learning to read alongside their children when students take these home. And all of these videos come in English and Spanish and 14 other languages. So the very first page of all of our decodables goes through explicit phonics instruction, where we tell you what phonics skills we're working on. And really telling kids up front, like whatever, here's the work that you're going to be doing in this book. This is what we're practicing. And the clearer we are, as Dr. Lindsay said, the better off our kids are. So all of our books are between 90 to 100% decodable. And the very last page of the book goes through the target phonics skills, those high frequency words, decodable words, and just some fun activities that kids can do to keep going with their phonics instruction. Go to the next one. And next are these Take Everywhere literacy packs. And this is the product that we have that really no one else has. We take in district data, whatever it is that you're using, and we put that into our reading algorithm, and students are matched with the phonics skills that they're working on. And they're personalized exactly for every child. They go out with the kid's name on it. They get a packet of books that say, the student's name. Students get to go anywhere with them, home with them, but it is super exciting for them to get books of their own. And if you would like to get in touch with anyone at Just Right Reader, you can request a sample on our website or follow up with Kathleen, our partnership director in Virginia. And I'm just going to toss her email into the chat in case anyone wants to write it down to follow up and learn more about the work that we're doing. But really just cannot thank Dr. Lindsay enough and the Reading League for putting on this wonderful event and for being able to get some really, really wonderful and targeted stuff that people can apply in the classroom tomorrow or in their districts tomorrow. So thank you, Dr. Lindsay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Catherine. I really appreciate it. We've got Angie on board next. She is our membership chair, and she'd love to share some information with everyone tonight.
So if you're not yet a member of the Reading League of Virginia, please consider joining. There are benefits for joining this professional organization. We make connections with others dedicated to the science of reading. And there are opportunities to participate in events such as tonight's with Dr. Lindsay. And it's a fun group with a common goal. The best thing about our membership right now is it is free. Thanks to our sponsor, Just Right Readers. Just use this QR code here on the screen and also the link shown on the slide. We have some great swag available. And I have on one of the sweatshirts tonight. There's nothing better than having a teammate ask about your um, reading league t-shirt when they see, or ask about the organization when they see your t-shirt. Again, here's the link. The t-shirts and the sweatshirts are a nice quality and reasonably priced. Finally, we want to introduce you to the Ambassador Program. It's a great way to be involved with the Reading League Virginia. Ambassadors can share the needs of their regions here in Virginia. They can volunteer on committees, and they are valuable members of our organization. Again, there's a QR code. And here is our email. And again, thank you so much for participating tonight and listening with Dr. Lindsay. And have a very safe evening. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.